Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Shada Campbell, and in today's tutorial we're going to be working with gouache. Gouache is a highly opaque watercolor medium. It has a wonderfully distinct look, it's beautiful to work with, and today I'm going to be using it to create a painting that showcases all of the wildflowers of Prince Edward Island. So this is the piece that I'm starting with. I've worked out a sort of cohesive design that depicts all of my favorite Prince Edward Island wildflowers. So I worked that out in my sketchbook. I traced it onto a piece of tracing paper, and then I've used graphite transfer paper to transfer my trace onto a piece of hot pressed watercolor paper. And then I've also got my gouache. I've got a set of 24 tubes. These are from Arteza. I'll link them in the description below because they are good value gouache. And yes, let's talk a little more about hot pressed paper. It's watercolor paper. You don't often use it for watercolor because it's very dense, but because it is so dense, it lacks much tooth or texture, and it's beautifully smooth and wonderful for using with gouache. So now is definitely the time to get out that pack of hot pressed paper that you are never sure when to use. Okay, and let's talk a little about the gouache itself. It comes in these little tubes. When you squeeze it onto your palette, it will be the consistency of toothpaste, but for you to use the gouache, you really want it to be the consistency of like a creamy soup. So what I do is I'll just squeeze out all of the colors that I'm going to be using. I'm starting with greens for all the plant stems. So I'm, going to use green, white, maybe some blues, some yellows. So I've got all the colors that I need here to mix up a whole variety of shades of green. And as I said, for me to have a medium that I can paint with, I need it to be the consistency of soup. So I'm mixing in a lot of water. You do not want to use gouache straight out of the tube. It'll be way too thick to work with. Now, the magic of gouache is that you mix in all this water and it still stays wonderfully opaque. I just refer to gouache as the magic paint because it has this wonderful consistency. Once you work in that water, it has this smooth consistency. It hits the paper and it's smooth and it flows, but it's very, very opaque. So you get this true color, and it's just the most wonderful sort of poster paint. So you can see me here, I've mixed up a dark cool green. I have some scrap paper or cardstock that I'm testing my colors on. So I always want to know that I've got the color right before I hit the page. And then I'm ready to take my round synthetic paintbrush here. One word of advice, you should never mix your paints with the same paintbrush you're going to paint with, but do as I say, not as I do, because you want a nice clean paintbrush. And you can see here as I begin to paint on my piece of hot pressed watercolor paper that the paint just flows onto the page. I'm using a nylon round brush, so I'm able to use the tip of the brush to sort of outline my shapes and get a nice detail of the stem or the shape of the leaf. And then I'm able to use the belly or the body of the brush to really let loose some of the color that's contained within my paintbrush that I'm holding in my brush, and I'm able to lay down lots of this wonderfully opaque paint. The paint may look like it's not one shade when it hits the page, but that's just because it's drying. And as it dries, it will dry slightly lighter and it dries to one true color. So it's really nice. You get this beautiful true color. And you can see here, I've moved on to the leaves of the lupin, and I'm just painting half of each leaf. And that's so that I get a nice contrast. I'll use a darker green later on, and it'll show sort of a nice detail in the leaf. If you haven't tried gouache before, I can't recommend it enough. It's not expensive. These Arteza ones are a good price. As I said, I'll link them in the description below. You mix in lots of water so your paint goes a long way. It hits the page and it's beautifully opaque. It's smooth. It's easy to work with. And I think because of the way that gouache is, you're less likely to blend it on the page. And at least the way that I was taught to use gouache in high school is sort of to lay down one color and then to do what I'm doing here, to come back in later once it's dried and use another color. And so you can see here I'm using this minty blue to add some veining to the leaves of these roses. And so I'm not blending as I paint. I'm laying down one color, wait for it to dry, then come back in with another color. So I did have a lot of fun doing this painting. Here with the leaves of the lupin, you can see I'm doing the same thing. I'm coming back in with a second color, so I don't have to worry about blending or shading. I'm treating it very much like a coloring book, and I'm painting each section of my painting one by one and sort of taking things slow and easy. Now, it's very difficult to talk about gouache or even think about gouache without talking about Anna Rifle Bond. And you probably are familiar with her artwork and illustration if you've been in any bookshop or stationery shop in the last few years. Anna is the woman behind Rifle Paper Company, and her artwork is done with gouache. She does these very flat, graphic, sort of vintagey florals and people. And if you look up Rifle Paper Co., I'm sure you'll recognize the work. So even when I was painting in gouache, it's hard to sort of get her artwork out of your head. But the way she approaches gouache is sort of the typical way to use it, where you're building color and detail layer by layer as opposed to doing a lot of blending. Well, I thought it was about time for me to show you my crazy green palette. I just like to work with one color at a time. That way I can mix up a whole bunch of different greens, do all the plants on the page, and then I'll wash the palette, take a little moment, clean up, switch my water, really rinse my brushes, and then now I'm able to come back in and I don't have to worry about kind of getting murky yellows or something when I go to paint the flower petals. So here I've mixed up a nice light yellow with lots of white in it, and I'm going to start painting my marsh marigolds. These are typical wildflowers in the bogs and marshes on Prince Edward Island, and they're very cute. And again, I'm just doing what I did with the greens, starting with one color, so a light yellow, and then I'll come back in once it has dried and add some darker yellow, add some detail, some shading. Here, I'm also taking that yellow and doing all the centers of the little blue asters. I've mixed up a brown, and I'm doing the stem of my lupin. And then it's getting interesting because I'm about to mix up a nice purple and start painting some of these lupins. And the lupin is sort of like our claim to fame here on Prince Edward Island. If you come here in June, there are fields just full of beautiful wild lupins, and they're all pink and purple and white. It's quite something to see, and you'll definitely see them on my Instagram come the spring. So again, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm just taking that purple, one color, painting in all the petals, and then I'll go back in later and add a different shade of purple. For the blue asters, I'm doing this very, very light periwinkle, and I'm just concentrating on how I'm using my brush, I guess, especially for a flower like an aster or a daisy. It's really up to you to use your brush stroke to get the look of those petals, right? So thinking about how you're using the brush, if you do use a nylon round pointed brush like me, you're able to really use the tip of the brush for the detail versus the belly or the body of the brush for sort of laying down more color. And here I'm coming back in, adding some light purple petals to my lupin. Once that's done, I'll add a little darker purple to the aster, and so on and so on. And that's sort of my favorite way to work with gouache, is to just let one layer dry, build up the next layer, add some detail, some shadow. And it's actually a really, I think, approachable and easy way to do things because you're not blending, you're not sort of getting overwhelmed with trying to shade perfectly and mixing all these paints. It's just one color at a time. And you can see here, I'm just going forward and adding more color. I've got my wild roses, my lady slipper, which is sort of a funny looking flower, but that is our provincial wildflower. And yeah, I'm just going to continue to work with my gouache until my piece is all done. And that's what it looked like when it was all finished. I've added many layers to add detail. I did do maybe just a little bit of shading, but otherwise it was one layer at a time. And this piece I'm actually going to turn into a print and have it in the shop this summer. So I'm excited about that. Remember, I have a little seasonal gift shop here on Prince Edward Island. It's just open June through September. And so this will be one of the things that you could potentially purchase if you happen to stop by, if you happen to be in the neighborhood of the Canadian Maritimes. Well, thank you guys so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little about gouache. I absolutely love this medium. If you're interested in the paint, check the description below and make sure to click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.